This is Land of Havilah with the second book of the Bible, the book of Exodus. We'll read the entire book and add some comments. We're reading from the World English Bible because it's accurate to the original Hebrew, and it's one of the only modern translations of the Bible that's not copyrighted. Therefore, we can post the entire text without legal issues. The name Land of Havilah comes from Genesis chapter 2. Havilah is a place with all the good stuff. Exodus picks up the history of Israel where Genesis left off. In Genesis, God spoke to Abraham and told him he would be with him, that he would be a shield to him, and that he would greatly reward him. Most importantly, God said the same promises and blessings would apply to Abraham's descendants on an everlasting basis. Abraham had a son in his old age, Isaac, and Isaac had a son, Jacob. As promised, God attached the blessings and promises to each generation. God changed Jacob's name to Israel and gave him 12 sons. Israel and his family lived in Canaan, but toward the end of Israel's life, his son Joseph became second in command of Egypt. A famine arose, and since there was food in Egypt and Joseph was ruling Egypt, Israel and his entire family migrated there, 70 people in all, including his sons, their wives, and all they had. Together they were the house of Israel. Jacob lived out his life in Egypt, then Joseph lived out his there as well. By the end of Genesis, the entire house of Israel was still in Egypt, but according to what Joseph said before he died, one day God would visit the house of Israel and bring them out. The bringing out would become known as the Exodus. Reading now from the book of Exodus, chapter 1, verse 1. Now these are the names of the sons of Israel who came into Egypt. Every man and his household came with Jacob: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. All the souls who came out of Jacob's body were 70 souls, and Joseph was in Egypt already. Joseph died, as did all his brothers and all that generation. The children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, and multiplied, and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Comment: in verse 7, the children of Israel were in Egypt for many generations. They multiplied until numbers-wise the land was filled with them. This was according to the promise God gave Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to give them so many descendants they couldn't be counted. God told Jacob, quote, "Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you a great nation there." Genesis 46:3. So Jacob went, and God did. The house of Israel didn't mix with the local Egyptians by the plan of God. God didn't want them to be absorbed into the Egyptian population. They spoke Hebrew, not the language of Egypt. When they arrived, they made themselves repulsive to the Egyptians on purpose by making very clear that they were shepherds, knowing, quote, "Every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians," Genesis 46:34. As Christians, we should maintain our identities as well, even when Christianity is looked upon as something negative or even abominable. The commandment for us is, quote, "Come out from among them and be separate," 2 Corinthians 6:17. God's plan is to, quote, "purify unto himself a peculiar people," Titus 2:14. We are, quote, "a chosen race, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession," 1 Peter 2:9. So let's embrace our peculiarity as Christians as God commands us. Otherwise, we'll never make a successful exodus from the evils of this world. In Egypt, as the generations went by, verse 8, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who didn't know Joseph. He said to his people, 'Behold, the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let's deal wisely with them, lest they multiply.' And it happened that when any war breaks out, they also join themselves to our enemies and fight against us and escape out of the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. They built storage cities for Pharaoh, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out." Comment: the Pharaoh of Joseph's time honored Israel when they came into the country, but in verse 8 a new Pharaoh arose who didn't know his history, how Joseph saved the nation from famine, and all the good that Joseph did in Egypt was forgotten. With the Israelites multiplying rapidly, Pharaoh became afraid of their large numbers, and to keep them from rebelling, he put them to slavery. His plan in verse 10 was to weaken them with hard labor, but they only kept multiplying because the hand of God was on them. Nobody can hold back God's hand. Quote, His hand is stretched out, and who shall turn it back? Isaiah 14:27. Speaking of the way the Egyptians viewed Israel, verse 12, they were grieved because of the children of Israel. The Egyptians ruthlessly made the children of Israel serve, and they made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and in brick, and in all kinds of service in the field, all their service in which they ruthlessly made them serve. Comment, the Egyptians enslaved the Israelites, in other words. They were ruthless in verse 13, and made their lives bitter with hard service in verse 14. God predicted it in Genesis chapter 15. It came to Abraham in a dark and terrible dream. God told Abraham, quote, Know for sure that your offspring will live as foreigners in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them. They will afflict them 400 years, end quote. In the same dream, God said, quote, I will also judge that nation whom they will serve. Afterward they will come out with great wealth, end quote. To be clear, God would judge Egypt, and Israel would come out with great wealth. But with Egypt subjugating Israel ruthlessly, it's hard to see how they could come out at all, much less come out with great wealth. But God is with them. Verse 15. The king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah and the name of the other Puah. And he said, When you perform the duty of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God and didn't do what the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the baby boys alive. The king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, Why have you done this thing and have saved the boys alive? The midwives said to Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women aren't like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. Because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Comment, Pharaoh was afraid of Israel's increasing numbers, so he told the midwives to kill the male babies at birth. In verse 17, the midwives feared God, end quote. So they didn't kill the male babies, as commanded, but concocted a falsehood about the Hebrew women that they gave birth before the midwife could get there. It was false, but it was righteous. Interestingly, of the 10 Commandments, none of them says, Thou shalt not lie. The closest is the 9th commandment, which says, Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor, Exodus 20, verse 16. This speaks of a particular kind of falsehood which is against someone, accusing them of what they didn't do, which obviously would be evil and malicious. But let's not get the wrong idea. Outside of the 10 Commandments, there are still plenty of commandments against lying. For example, quote, All liars, their part is in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, Revelation 21:8. However, there's a difference between a lie and a righteous falsehood, because every now and then we come on a situation where the fear of God requires us to tell a falsehood. The midwives told not a malicious falsehood against anyone, but a benevolent falsehood for someone for the male babies. This falsehood was so benevolent that God rewarded them with families of their own in verse 21. Usually, if we tell a lie, it's to get ourselves out of hot water. It's wrong and it's cowardly. The midwives knew that this falsehood could get them in hot water. It could get them killed. It was heroic. They could have sinned by killing the babies and perhaps saved themselves by so doing. But, quote, Although a sinner does evil 100 times and may lengthen his life, still I know that it will be well for those who fear God, who fear him openly, Ecclesiastes 8:12. The midwives obeyed God rather than Pharaoh, which is what the apostles said to do in the New Testament. When their lives were on the line, they said, quote, We must obey God rather than men, Acts 5:29. Men can reward us and punish us, but they can't do either as well as God. So the fear of God is the way to go. Maybe once in a great while it's wrong to tell the truth, and a falsehood's the only right thing. So how do we know when to tell the truth and when to tell a falsehood? It depends on which one has the fear of God in it. Quote, By the fear of God men depart from evil, Proverbs 16:6. Coming up, since the Israelites are still increasing in number, verse 22, Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, You shall cast every son who is born into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. Comment, the commandment to the midwives didn't work, so now Pharaoh's commanding all his people, meaning anyone and everyone, to cast every newborn Israelite boy into the river. It's the law. Exodus 2 is next at landofhavilah.net, Exodus 2.